In October of 1979, a marine investigator from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived in Dutch Harbor, Alaska, to examine the hull of a 98-foot steel king crab vessel called the Nordic Venture. What he found in the dry dock that morning would produce one of the shortest and most heavily qualified incident reports in the NTSB's Maritime File Archive. 5 parallel gouges ran along the starboard hull below the waterline, each nearly an inch deep in quarter-inch marine-grade steel, each approximately 6 inches apart, beginning just aft of the bow and running 17 feet toward the stern in a pattern that curved downward as it progressed, as if whatever had made the marks had been dragged, or had dragged itself, along the hull while sinking. The investigator, a man named Leonard Price, who had spent 19 years examining damaged vessels for the federal government, wrote in his preliminary notes that the marks were inconsistent with ice contact, anchor drag, or any mechanical cause I have encountered. He also noted, in a detail that would not appear in the final report, that biological tissue had been recovered from inside 3 of the 5 gouges, tissue that was gray-white in color, fibrous in structure, and did not match any species in the University of Alaska Fairbanks Marine Biology reference catalog when it arrived at the lab 3 weeks later. The tissue samples were placed in cold storage at the university's Fairbanks campus, assigned a reference number, and filed alongside several thousand other unidentified marine specimens in a basement freezer that was inventoried once a year and examined by almost no one. They would remain there, unanalyzed and unremarked upon, for 13 years. But the damage to the Nordic Venture's hull was not the reason the NTSB had sent an investigator to Dutch Harbor. They had sent Leonard Price because a 23-year-old deckhand named James Robert Pruitt had gone overboard during the incident and was never recovered, and because the sworn testimony of the 4 surviving crew members, given separately, on 4 consecutive days, in a rented office above the Elbow Room Bar on Dutch Harbor's main street, described the circumstances of his death in terms that no federal agency was prepared to put on the public record. To understand what happened to Jimmy Pruitt and to the crew of the Nordic Venture, we need to go back 3 days before Price arrived in Dutch Harbor, to the morning of October 11, 1979, when Dale Kessler pointed his boat toward the most productive and least forgiving stretch of water in the Bering Sea. Dale Kessler was 47 years old in October of 1979, a second-generation crab fisherman who had worked the Bering Sea since he was 19, first as a deckhand on his father's vessel, the Nordic Promise, and then, after his father drowned in a storm off Amak Island in 1971, as the owner and operator of the Nordic Venture, a boat he had purchased with the insurance money from his father's death and named in tribute to the boat that had killed him. By the fall of 1979, Kessler had survived 28 consecutive Bering Sea crab seasons, a record that only a handful of captains in the Dutch Harbor fleet could match. He was known in the harbor as a man who was hard to work for, harder to impress, and almost impossible to rattle, the kind of captain who had no patience for superstition, no tolerance for hesitation, and no interest in any explanation that did not begin with observable fact and end with a number on a page. Harbor records from Dutch Harbor confirmed that the Nordic Venture departed at 0540 hours on October 11th, fueled, iced, and carrying a full string of 240 king crab pots stacked on her deck and secured for the run north. The vessel manifest lists 5 crew, Kessler as captain and owner, Jimmy Pruitt and Tommy Wyatt as deckhands, Lyle Strand as pot mechanic, and Carl O'Lerid, a 41-year-old engineer who had been with Kessler for 9 consecutive seasons and was, according to every other crew member's testimony, the only man aboard that Kessler trusted without reservation. According to the harbor master's departure log, the Nordic Venture was one of the last boats to leave for the late-season king crab opening. Most of the fleet had departed 2 days earlier. Kessler was late because he had been debating whether to go at all. 2 consecutive bad seasons had put the boat payment 3 months behind, and the bank in Seattle that held the note on the Nordic Venture had informed him by letter, a letter that was later recovered from the vessels. Wheelhausen entered into the NTSB file that if the balance was not substantially reduced by December, they would initiate repossession proceedings. In a letter he wrote to his brother in Anacortes, Washington, 3 weeks after the events that would follow, Kessler described the decision to fish in terms that suggest a man who understood he was out of options. He wrote, "The bank gave me until December. I needed the canyon. There was no other water that was going to save the boat." The canyon he was referring to was the Pribilof Canyon, a deep underwater trench running along the edge of the continental shelf in the Bering Sea, approximately 90 nautical miles north of St. Paul Island. The Pribilof Canyon is a geological feature where the seafloor drops from approximately 100 meters to over 400 in less than a mile. And in the late 1970s, it was one of the most productive king crab grounds in the northern Pacific, the kind of water that could fill a boat's hold in 3 days if the crab were there, and that could kill a crew in less than an hour if the weather turned. Among Bering Sea fishermen, the canyon's eastern rim carried a reputation that went beyond the usual hazards of wind and sea state. Captains who had fished it for decades spoke of equipment that behaved unpredictably along the canyon wall, sonar returns that didn't correspond to anything on the bottom, depth finders that produced readings inconsistent with the known bathymetry, and in stories that circulated in Dutch Harbor's bars, but were never committed to any written record. Pots that came up damaged in ways that crab don't cause and rock doesn't explain. The NOEA Oceanographic Survey published in 1977 documented thermal layers and current patterns along the canyon rim that could produce erratic sonar behavior, a finding the NTSB would later cite as the explanation for everything the crew of the Nordic Venture reported. The ship's log for the Nordic Venture records a 12-hour transit from Dutch Harbor to the fishing grounds, uneventful except for a single notation in Kessler's handwriting at 1340 hours. Picked up VHF traffic from the Resolute. Jorgensen says stay off the eastern rim. Didn't say why. The Resolute was a 120-foot king crab vessel captained by Ed Jorgensen, a veteran of the Bering Sea Fleet who had been fishing the Pribilof Canyon since the early 1960s and who was known, among other things, for not offering advice unless he meant it. Jorgensen had fished the eastern rim longer than almost anyone in the fleet, and several captains who testified in unrelated Coast Guard proceedings over the following decade would reference him as a man who had stopped fishing that particular stretch of water years before the Nordic Venture incident, though none of them would say why, and Jorgensen himself never gave a statement. Kessler's log notes the warning, but does not record a response. In his testimony to Price, Kessler stated that he dismissed Jorgensen's advice because Jorgensen was, in his words, the kind of man who told you not to fish somewhere because he wanted to fish there himself. This would prove to be a misjudgment that Kessler would revisit for the rest of his life. The Nordic Venture arrived at the eastern rim of the Pribilof Canyon at approximately 1800 hours on October 11th and began setting pots along the canyon edge in a string that ran parallel to the depth contour where the bottom dropped from 60 to 80 fathoms. October in the Bering Sea at that latitude means 18 hours of darkness per day, and the remaining hours are a pale gray that barely qualifies as light. The sea state that night was running 12 to 15 feet with a short, violent chop on top, the wind holding steady at 35 knots from the northwest, the air temperature at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that meant the spray froze on contact with any exposed surface, and the Nordic Venture was already carrying an estimated 4 tons of accumulated ice on her superstructure that the crew had been chipping with baseball bats and mallets for 2 straight days. The deck lights illuminated a small circle of churning black water around the vessel. Beyond that circle, there was nothing. No horizon line, no other vessels in sight, just the wind and the sound of the sea hitting the hull and the steady, mechanical rhythm of pots going over the rail. The first 2 sets were routine. Kessler logged coordinates for each pot string. O'Leary monitored the sonar and engine systems from the wheelhouse. And the deck crew, Pruitt, Wyatt, and Strand, cycled through the physical labor of baiting, stacking and launching the 700-pound steel pots over the starboard rail in a process that took approximately 45 seconds per pot and required the kind of coordination that only came from men who had done it 1,000 times before. The third set began at 0200 hours on October 12th. It is here that the record begins to change. Carl Olerud's log entry at 0215 reads, sonar return at 180 fathoms, large biological, moving vertical, along canyon wall. Not whale. Speed and trajectory inconsistent. This was a man with 9 seasons of Bering Sea experience. A man who had watched sonar screens for thousands of hours, and who could distinguish a pollock, school from a halibut aggregation at 200 fathoms by the shape of the return alone. When Carl O'Leary wrote, not whale, he was not guessing. The NTSB would later dismiss this entry as evidence of the thermal distortion phenomenon documented in the 1977 NOAA survey, and the official report cites this explanation with a confidence that the supporting evidence does not justify. But the testimony of all 4 crew members tells a different story, the same story, told independently, without coordination, over 4 consecutive days. Tommy Wyatt, in his deposition, stated that he was on deck securing pot line when O'Leary called down from the wheelhouse on the vessel's internal speaker and told the crew to look over the starboard side. Wyatt's testimony describes what he saw on the sonar display when he came up to the wheelhouse. A single large mass, rising vertically along the canyon wall at a speed he estimated at 6 to 8 knots, moving straight up a submerged cliff face in a trajectory that no whale, no fish, and no known marine animal would follow. Lyle Strand's testimony corroborates Wyatt's account and adds a detail that appears in no other deposition. Strand stated that the sonar return was not a single solid mass, but appeared to have what he described as extensions, like arms or limbs, that move independently of the main body, the way a man's arms move when he's climbing a ladder. Kessler, who had come to the wheelhouse when O'Leary called, stated in his testimony that he watched the return rise from approximately 180 fathoms to approximately 40 fathoms, a vertical ascent of over 800 feet, and then stop. It held position at 40 fathoms for what the ship's log timestamps indicate was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then it began to move horizontally, directly toward the Nordic Venture. The sonar showed the contact closing from 150 yards, then 100, then 50. Kessler's testimony states that at approximately 25 yards from the vessel, the return disappeared from the sonar display, not because it had dived or turned away, but because it had entered the blind zone directly beneath the hull, where the sonar transducer cannot distinguish a contact from the vessel's own acoustic signature. For several seconds, according to all 4 crew members, nothing happened. The sea was as it had been. The wind was unchanged. The deck lights showed the same churning circle of black water. Then the Nordic Venture was struck from below. Kessler's deposition describes it not as a collision, but as a grip, a sustained lateral force applied to the starboard hull below the waterline, pulling the vessel sideways and down as if something had attached itself to the steel and was leaning its weight against it. The Nordic Venture rolled nearly 40 degrees to starboard. That number bears emphasis, because any Bering Sea fisherman listening to this will understand what it means. A 98-foot steel crab boat loaded with pots, riding low in heavy seas, rolled 40 degrees by a force applied to one side of the hull. The hydraulic pot launcher, which weighed over a ton, tore free of its deck mounts and slid to starboard. O'Leary, at the helm, stated that the vessel did not respond to corrective steering because the force was below the waterline and the knee. Rudder had no authority against it, like trying to steer a car while someone lifts the rear wheels off the ground. The sound, described independently by all 4 men, was a deep, continuous scraping, metal on metal, or more precisely, something hard and organic dragging across steel under immense pressure. Kessler said he could feel it through the deck plates in his boots, a vibration that traveled up through the keel and into the superstructure like a frequency his body recognized as wrong before his mind could process what it meant. Tommy Wyatt was thrown against the port gunwale with enough force to fracture 2 ribs, an injury documented in the medical records filed at the Dutch Harbor Clinic 2 days later. Lyle Strand caught himself on a potstack and held on. Jimmy Pruitt was not as fortunate. Pruitt had been standing at the starboard rail working pot line when the vessel rolled. Wyatt's testimony, given through what the deposition transcript notes as visible physical pain from his rib fractures, states that Pruitt was thrown against the rail, caught himself with both hands for approximately 2 seconds, and then went over the side into the Bering Sea, water that was 28 degrees, running 15-foot swells and over 100 fathoms deep at the canyon's edge. But Wyatt's testimony includes a detail that Kessler's does not, a detail that he repeated without variation in 3 separate interviews, and that forms the most contested passage in the entire sealed file. Wyatt stated that as Pruitt went over the starboard rail, the deck lights illuminated something in the water alongside the hull, pressed against the steel, gripping it. He described it in a single sentence. There was something on the hull, pale, with arms, and it was holding on. When pressed by the investigator to elaborate, Wyatt stated that what he saw was approximately 7 to 8 feet in length, pale gray-white in color, and appeared to be gripping the hull, plating with hands. Though he said the word was inadequate, because the fingers were too long, perhaps 10 or 12 inches, and the skin between them was stretched taut like the webbing on a duck's foot, and the arms attached to something that was not a human torso, but was shaped, in the parts he could see above the waterline, like the upper body of a woman. The face, he said, was turned toward the deck, looking up at him, and the eyes were black, entirely black. No white, no iris, just dark and open, and watching him with an attention that he described as calm and focused and completely without recognition that he was a living thing with a name. He said the lower portion was not visible. It was below the waterline, but the hull was vibrating in a way that suggested something long and heavy was moving against it beneath the surface, using the steel as a surface to brace against. He said there was hair, dark, long, spread across the hull, plating like kelp in a current plastered flat by the sea. He said the mouth was open, and the teeth were wrong. Pruitt hit the water less than 10 feet from where Wyatt described seeing the figure. Wyatt stated that he heard Pruitt surface once, shouting, a single word that Wyatt could not make out over the wind, and then a sound that he described as a splash unlike a man thrashing, heavier, more deliberate, as if something large had turned in the water with purpose. Strand, from his position near the stern, corroborates the sound and adds that the water on the starboard side, illuminated by the deck floodlights, was disturbed in a pattern inconsistent with wave action, a long, sinuous wake moving away from the hull toward the area where Pruitt had entered the water, a wake that Strand estimated at over 15 feet in length, and that moved with the fluid, continuous motion of something that had no joints. Neither man heard Pruitt again. Kessler's testimony does not describe seeing the creature on the hull. His position in the wheelhouse did not give him a direct sight line to the starboard waterline. But his testimony includes a detail that supports the crew's account from a different angle. He states that when the gripping force on the hull released, a moment he felt as the vessel riding, itself with a lurch that was almost as violent as the initial roll. The sonar display showed the contact again, now moving away from the vessel, descending back toward the canyon wall at a speed that the ship's log records as approximately 4 knots. The return descended to 180 fathoms and stopped. It held position at the depth where it had first appeared, motionless, for the next 6 hours. Kessler knew this because he watched it the entire time he searched for Jimmy Pruitt. The Nordic Ventures searchlight records and radio logs document a 6-hour search that began immediately after the incident. Kessler brought the vessel around and began a standard man-overboard search pattern, using the searchlight to sweep the water in expanding circles from the point where Pruitt went over. The Coast Guard was notified by VHF radio at 0247 hours. An AC-130 Hercules out of Kodiak was airborne within 90 minutes. Arriving on scene at approximately 4:15, the aerial and surface search continued through the daylight hours of October 12th. Pruitt's body was never recovered. In the letter to his brother, Kessler wrote about the search in terms that the formal testimony does not capture. We looked for 6 hours, and the whole time I could see it on the sonar, sitting at 40 fathoms, right where it had stopped. It didn't leave. It just sat there, below us, while we drove circles over it, looking for Jimmy. I don't know what that means. I don't want to know what that means. The letter continues. I have been on this water for 28 years, and I have pulled men from it alive, and I have pulled them from it dead. But I have never lost a man to something that was right there on the screen the whole time. Something I could see, but could not name, and could not get to, and could not fight. The Nordic Venture arrived in Dutch Harbor on the evening of October 13th, and the dry dock examination began the following morning. Leonard Price documented the 5 parallel gouges with the methodical precision of a man who has examined hundreds of damaged hulls and has never seen anything like what he was looking at. His examination log notes the depth, spacing, curvature, and trajectory of each gouge. The inward deformation of the steel at the edges, consistent with gripping force, not sliding impact, and the biological tissue recovered from the interior of 3 of the 5 tracks. He photographed the tissue against a ruler for scale and noted its gray-white color, its fibrous consistency, and the fact that a section of it appeared to include what he described, in carefully chosen language, as a fragment of structured membrane, possibly integumentary, with regularly spaced attachment points suggestive of webbed connective tissue. The tissue samples were packed in dry ice, cataloged, and shipped to the University of Alaska Fairbanks Marine Biology Department on October 19, 1979. The accompanying documentation describes them as biological material, unidentified, recovered from interior surface of hull damage, gray-white in color, fibrous, consistent with epidermal and subdermal tissue of marine origin. No analysis was requested. No analysis was funded. The samples were logged into the university's cold storage archive, assigned reference number UAFMB 791142, and placed in a basement freezer alongside several thousand other unidentified biological specimens collected from Alaskan waters over the previous 2 decades. The NTSB investigation concluded in November 1979 with a final report that classified the incident as hull damage from submerged ice contact, resulting in crew member loss overboard, body not recovered. The sonar readings were attributed to thermal distortion caused by the canyon's documented temperature stratification. The tissue samples were not mentioned. The testimony of the 4 surviving crew members, which contradicted every finding in the official record, was sealed under a federal order that cited insufficient evidence to support witness claims and potential for unwarranted public alarm based on unsubstantiated observations. Leonard Price signed the report, but in a handwritten note found in his personal files after his retirement in 1993, a note that was never part of any official record and that his widow would later donate, along with his papers, to the NTSB Historical Archive where it sits today, accessible to anyone who knows to ask for it. Price wrote a single paragraph about the Nordic Venture case. It reads, "The damage is not consistent with ice. I have stated this in my preliminary notes, and I state it again here. 5 parallel gouges, evenly spaced, with tissue in the tracks. Something gripped that hull. The thermal distortion theory does not account for what 4 men described independently, without variation, over 4 days of sworn testimony. I signed the report because I was told to sign the report. That is the truth of it. Dale Kessler sold the Nordic venture in December of 1979, 2 months after the incident, at a price the Dutch harbor records show was 40% below market value. He never returned to the Pribilof Canyon. He took a job as a shoreside fish processor in King Cove and worked there quietly until his retirement in 1997. And in all those years, according to the men who worked alongside him, he never once spoke about what had happened on the water. In 2003, a freelance journalist named Martha Harwell tracked Kessler down for a long-form piece on unexplained maritime incidents in the Bering Sea. The recorded interview lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. In it, Kessler describes the creature alongside the hull in greater detail than his 1979 testimony allowed. The black eyes with no white and no iris. The way the dark hair spread across the hull, plaiting like kelp in a slow current. The hands that gripped the steel with fingers that were too long and connected by membrane that stretched when they pressed down. And beneath the waterline, a sense of something with length and mass and a way of moving that had no joints, no bones that he could see, just continuous motion like an eel or a snake pressed against the hull. He told Harwell that Tommy Wyatt had called him once, in 1985, and that the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, because neither man could discuss what they had seen without what Kessler described as the feeling that comes when your body remembers something it hasn't finished being afraid of. He told her that Jimmy Pruitt's mother had written to him every year for 10 years, asking what had really happened to her son, and that he had never answered a single letter. Then Kessler said something that Harwell noted was the only moment in the interview where his voice changed, dropped lower, slower, as if he were saying something he needed her to hear as a person and not as a journalist. He said, "It wasn't hunting us. It was curious. It came up the canyon wall to look at the boat, and it held on to see what we were. And Jimmy went in the water, and I think it took him the way you'd pick up a thing that fell near you, not because you wanted it, but because it was there, and you wanted to understand what it was. But it lives at 100 fathoms, and Jimmy didn't." The Harwell interview was never published. According to her correspondence with her editor, the piece was killed after a legal inquiry from a federal agency she was not permitted to name. The audio recording remains in Harwell's personal possession. What the federal record does not reflect is what happened to the coordinates Dale Kessler logged on the night of October 12, 1979. In 1981, 2 years after the Nordic Venture incident, NOAA issued a quiet advisory designating a narrow section of the Pribilof Canyon's eastern rim as a biological hazard zone, a classification typically reserved for areas with toxic algal blooms or dangerous concentrations of venomous marine species. The advisory covered the exact coordinates where Kessler had been setting pots on the night Jimmy Pruitt went into the water. The designation remained in effect for 2 years. In 1983, it was removed without explanation, without a follow-up survey, and without any public record of why it had been issued or why it was no longer considered necessary. The coordinates were open again, and in January of 1992, a 1-100- and -60- 5-foot pollock factory trawler called the Agnes Marie set her midwater nets along the eastern rim of the Pribilof Canyon, at coordinates that differed from Dale Kessler's 1979 position by less than 1/3 of a nautical mile. What the Agnes Marie's fishmaster hauled from those nets, and what a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks would discover when she cross-referenced the tissue against the university's cold storage archive, would reopen a chain of evidence that had been sealed, frozen, and deliberately forgotten for 13 years. The tissue samples that Leonard Price had scraped from the fall gouges in the Nordic Venture's hull were about to have company in the lab, and the match between them would prove that whatever Dale Kessler had encountered on the eastern rim of the Pribilof Canyon in October of 1979 had not left. It had been there, in the dark, at the edge of the continental shelf, the entire time. The coordinates that Dale Kessler logged on the night of October 12, 1979, the coordinates where the Nordic venture was gripped, where Jimmy Pruitt went into the Bering Sea and did not come back, sat in a sealed NTSB file for 13 years, referenced in no public document, printed on no chart, and known to no one outside the 4 surviving crew members and the federal investigator who had been told to close the case. But coordinates do not care whether they are classified. The water does not change because an agency seals a report. And in January of 1992, the Bering Sea pollock fishery brought a 165-foot factory trawler called the Agnes Marie to the eastern rim of the Pribilof Canyon, where she set her midwater nets at a depth of 200 meters, less than a third of a nautical mile from the position where Kessler had been hauling crab pots on the night. His boat was pulled sideways, and his youngest crewman was taken from the water. What the Agnes Marie recovered in those nets would produce a forensic link between 2 incidents separated by 13 years, a link that should not exist, that no one was looking for, and that at least 2 federal agencies would spend considerable effort trying to make disappear. The Agnes Marie was a product of the Bering Sea pollock boom of the late 1980s and early 1990s, a period when the fishery was one of the most intensive harvesting operations on Earth, with factory trawlers working around the clock, dragging nets the width of a football field through waters that had never experienced industrial fishing at this scale. She was owned by a Seattle-based processing company called Meridian Seafoods, crewed by 32 men, and equipped with a below-deck processing factory that could fillet, freeze, and package 40 tons of pollock in a 24-hour shift. The vessel's NOA, a fisheries observer, a requirement on all factory trawlers in the Bering Sea at the time, was a 26-year-old Marine biologist named Kevin Liao, who had been assigned to the Agnes Marie for a 60-day rotation, and whose job was to monitor the catch for bycatch species, record haul data, and file daily reports with the NOA, a fisheries office in Juneau. But the man whose testimony would become the most detailed and most contested record of what the Agnes Marie pulled from the Pribilof Canyon was not the observer. It was the fishmaster. Henry Osborne, known to every crew member and to every captain in the Bering Sea pollock fleet as Hank, was 53 years old in January of 1992, and he had spent 26 of those years identifying, sorting, and cataloging every species that came up in a trawl net in the northern Pacific. He was the man responsible for knowing what was in the net, how much it weighed, what species it contained, and whether the catch met the regulatory requirements that governed the fishery. He was, by every account of the men who worked with him, methodical to the point of compulsion. A man who kept a personal species log in a weatherproof notebook that he carried in the inside pocket of his coat at all times, in which he recorded every unusual specimen, every anomalous catch, and every observation that he considered worth preserving in a handwriting so small and precise that the notebook's pages looked, at a distance, like printed text. In 26 years on the Bering Sea, Hank Osborne had never encountered a specimen he could not identify, at least to the family level. That record ended on the morning of January 14th, 1992. The Agnes Marie had been working the eastern edge of the Pribilof Canyon for 3 days when the haul in question came aboard. January in the Bering Sea, at that latitude, means perpetual darkness. The sun, if it appears at all, skims the southern horizon for a few hours of gray twilight before disappearing again, and the working light on a factory trawler comes entirely from the vessel's own floodlights, which illuminate the deck and the water immediately alongside the hull in a flat, industrial glare that makes the surrounding darkness feel absolute. The air temperature had been holding at 18 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 consecutive days, the wind at 25 knots, and ice was forming on every exposed surface above the waterline, on the railings, on the trawl cables, on the net reels, on the deck plates where the crew walked in boots that left prints in the frost. The ship's trawl log, maintained by the bridge watch officer, records that Net Set 47 was deployed at 0315 hours on January 14th at a depth of 200 meters, targeting a pollock aggregation that the vessel's sonar had been tracking for approximately 6 hours along the canyon wall. The bridge officer's notes for that shift include a marginal annotation that was not part of the standard log format, a handwritten note that reads, "Secondary return below target school, 350 meters plus, stationary on canyon wall. Large, not pollock, possibly halibut aggregation or geological feature. Does not move." This notation was not included in the NOA, observer's report, and it is not clear whether Kevin Liao was ever made aware of it. The net was towed for 4 hours and 18 minutes, a standard duration for a midwater set in those conditions, and was hauled at 733. The trawl log notes the haul weight at approximately 42 tons, consistent with a productive set, and the bycatch estimate at less than 3%, well within regulatory limits. Nothing else in the log suggests that the haul was unusual. The first indication that something was wrong came from the processing deck. The Agnes Marie's factory operated on a continuous flow system. The catch was released from the net into a below-deck hopper, fed by conveyor to sorting tables where crew members separated pollock from bycatch species, and then channeled to the fillet machines. At approximately 0755 hours, a processing crew member, whose name has been redacted from the NOAA, observer's report, stopped the conveyor and called for the fishmaster. Hank Osborne's species log, entry 4271, dated January 14, 1992, reads as follows. Called to sorting table at 0758. Crew has isolated a mass of biological material from conveyor. Material is not fish, not invertebrate. Not any species I have seen in 26 years in these waters. Tissue is gray-white, fibrous and cold to the touch, even on the heated processing deck. Mass approximately 14 pounds, partially degraded, consistent with tissue that has been torn from a larger organism rather than a whole specimen. The entry continues on the following page of the notebook, in handwriting that Osborne's wife would later tell investigators was noticeably less steady than his usual script. On closer examination, the tissue mass includes 3 distinct structural elements. First, a large section of skin, approximately 18 inches by 12 inches, smooth on the exterior surface, gray-white, with a texture I can only compare to dolphin skin, but no dolphin is this color, and the skin is thicker than any cetacean integument I have handled. Second, a fragment of membrane, approximately 6 inches across, thin, translucent at the edges, with a structure consistent with webbing. Specifically, the kind of interdigital membrane found in aquatic species between fingers or toes, but scaled to a size that would suggest a hand or forelimb of significant dimensions. Third, what appear to be 2 fragments of digits, elongated, curved, approximately 8 inches in length, with what I can only describe as a claw or nail structure at the terminal end. Osborne's log entry ends with a single line that he underlined twice. This is not a known species. The NOA fisheries observer, Kevin Liao, was on the processing deck within minutes of Osborne's initial examination. Liao's official report, filed with the NOA, a fisheries office in Juneau, on January 31, 1992, and later flagged, and later restricted from public access by an internal NOA, a directive, confirms Osborne's description in clinical detail and adds several observations of his own. Liao noted that the exterior surface of the skin section, when examined under the processing deck's fluorescent lights, displayed a faint pattern of pigmentation that he described as irregular mottling, darker at the center and lighter at the margins, inconsistent with any cetacean, pinnipt, or fish species in the NOAA North Pacific Reference Catalog. He also noted that the tissue emitted what he described as a distinct odor, not consistent with decomposition of known marine species, sharper, more acrid, with an organic quality that I can only compare to the smell of a tidal cave at low tide. Liao photographed the tissue from multiple angles using the standard issue camera provided by NOAA for observer documentation. He took 11 photographs, When the NOAA observer report was later restricted, the photographs were transferred to a federal facility whose location has not been disclosed. As far as the public record is concerned, they no longer exist. Lyell's report also notes a detail that Osborne's species log does not mention, a detail that the observer included in his official filing, and that may explain why the report was subsequently restricted. Lyell wrote that among the tissue fragments on the sorting table, partially embedded in the larger mass of skin, he observed what he described as a single strand of filamentous material, dark brown to black in color, approximately 14 inches in length, with a texture and diameter consistent with mammalian hair. He noted that the strand was attached at one end to the skin section and appeared to emerge from a follicular structure visible on the interior surface of the tissue, the underside of the skin, where it would have connected to the living organism. Hair on a marine animal of this apparent size and morphology was, as Liao noted in his report, with what reads as considerable understatement, not consistent with any catalogued species in the northern Pacific. Osborne, working with Liao, preserved the tissue samples in the vessel's industrial freezer in 3 separate sealed containers, labeled with the date, coordinates, net depth, and hull number, a level of documentation that reflected Osborne's instinct that what they had recovered was significant in a way that extended well beyond routine bycatch identification. He also preserved the hair strands separately, sealed in a labeled specimen bag. The Agnes Marie continued fishing for another 9 days before returning to Dutch Harbor on January 23rd. And during those 9 days, Osborne returned to the freezer 3 times to examine the samples and add observations to his species log. His third examination, conducted on January 19th, 5 days after the initial recovery, includes a passage that reveals how deeply the discovery had affected a man who prided himself on empirical detachment. Osborne wrote, "I have spent most of my adult life identifying what comes up in a net. I have handled every species in these waters, and a fair number that are not supposed to be in these waters, and I have never been unable to place a specimen at least into an order or a family. This tissue does not belong to any order I recognize. The skin is mammalian in texture, but the webbing is amphibian in structure. The digits are primate in proportion, but the claw structure is reptilian. I am recording this because I do not believe this material will remain in my possession, or in anyone's possession, for very long." He was correct. His second examination, conducted on January 16th, includes a hand-drawn diagram of the webbed membrane fragment that would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. The diagram shows a fan-shaped section of tissue with 5 attachment points along one edge, the points where, Osborne noted, the membrane would have connected to individual digits. The spacing between the attachment points is approximately 2 inches. Below the diagram, Osborne wrote, "If this is what I think it is, it's a hand, or part of one. A hand with webbing between the fingers, and the fingers were at least 8 inches long. But the most significant discovery was still 3 weeks away, and it would not be made aboard the Agnes Marie. It would be made in a basement laboratory at the University of Alaska Fairbanks by a 24-year-old graduate student who was not looking for what she found." Rebecca Trask was in the 2nd year of her master's program in marine biology at UAF in January of 1992, working on a thesis about genetic diversity in Bering Sea, invertebrate populations, a subject that required her to spend long hours in the university's cold storage facility, cataloging and cross-referencing biological samples collected from Alaskan waters over the previous 3 decades. When the Agnes Marie samples arrived at the university on February 5, 1992, shipped from Dutch Harbor in insulated containers with a cover letter from the NOAA, a fisheries office, requesting species identification, they were assigned to Trask as part of her laboratory duties. The request was routine. Unidentified tissue from trawl nets arrived at the university several times a year, and the identification process was usually straightforward. Run a genetic panel, compare against the reference database, file the result. Trask began the analysis on February 7th. The genetic panel produced no match against any species in the university's database, a result that was unusual but not unprecedented, as the database was incomplete for deep water species and some invertebrate families. What happened next was, by Trask's own account given in a recorded phone conversation with Hank Osborne 6 weeks later, an accident of curiosity. Standard procedure when a sample produced no database match was to flag it for further analysis and move on. But Trask, working late in the lab, decided to run the sample's genetic profile against the university's cold storage archive, not the active reference database, but the physical inventory of unanalyzed samples that had accumulated in the basement freezers over the decades. It was a cross-reference that no one had requested, no protocol required, and no supervisor had suggested. She did it because, in her words, the tissue didn't look like anything I had ever seen, and I wanted to know if anything like it had come through the lab before. The cold storage archive at UAF contained approximately 4,000 biological samples, most of them logged with minimal documentation. A species name if known, a collection date, a location, and a reference number. The vast majority had never been genetically analyzed. Trask pulled samples that were logged as unidentified marine tissue and began running comparative genetic panels. On the third day of cross-referencing, she found the match. Sample UA FAMB 791142, biological tissue collected from the interior of hull damage on the fishing vessel Nordic Venture, October 1979, Pribilof Canyon. Eastern Rim was a genetic match to the tissue recovered from the Agnes Murray's trawl net on January 14, 1992. The same species. The same genetic signature. 13 years apart, from the same stretch of water at the edge of the continental shelf. Trask's lab notebook for that day, February 10, 1992, contains a single entry written in block letters that she later said she did not remember. Writing, 79 sample matches, same canyon, same species, 13 years. She ran the analysis again the following morning to confirm. The result was identical. The 1979 samples, the gray-white tissue that Leonard Price had scraped from the gouges in the Nordic Venture's starboard hull, and that had sat in a freezer, unexamined, for over a decade, were genetically consistent with the tissue Hank Osborne had pulled from a trawl. Net at the same coordinates in 1992, the genetic profiles did not merely suggest the same species. They suggested the possibility, which Trask noted in her lab report with appropriate scientific caution, that the samples could have come from the same individual organism. The same creature, present in the Pribilof Canyon in 1979 and still present, or leaving biological evidence of its presence in 1992. It was at this point that Trask contacted her thesis advisor, a professor of marine biology named Dr. Alan Metcalf, and showed him the results. What happened over the following 72 hours would determine whether the connection between the Nordic Venture and the Agnes Marie would become part of the scientific record or would disappear into the same institutional silence that had swallowed Dale Kessler's testimony 13 years before. Metcalf reviewed Trask's data, confirmed her methodology, and according to Trask's account, made a phone call to the NOA, a regional office in Anchorage, that afternoon. Within 24 hours, 2 representatives from NOAA arrived at the university laboratory. Within 48 hours, the 1979 samples, UAFMB 791142, the tissue from the Nordic Venture's hull, were transferred from the university's cold storage to a federal facility. The transfer paperwork, obtained through a FOIA request filed in 2015, lists the receiving facility only as NOA, a Biological Resources Division, location classified. Trask had included the genetic match in a chapter of her master's thesis. Before the thesis was submitted for publication, that chapter was redacted, removed entirely, replaced with a standard acknowledgement of incomplete data and a recommendation for future study. Dr. Metcalf advised Trask to accept the redaction. The NOA observer's report from the Agnes Marie Kevin Liao's photographs. His clinical descriptions, his measurements, was restricted from public access under an internal directive that cited pending species classification as the reason for the restriction. The classification has been pending for 33 years. 6 weeks after confirming the genetic match, Rebecca Trask made a phone call to Hank Osborne at his home in Ballard, a neighborhood in Seattle where many retired and active Bering Sea fishermen lived. The conversation was recorded by Osborne, who had developed the habit of taping phone calls related to the incident after what he described to colleagues as inquiries from people who did not identify themselves in the weeks following the Agnes Marie's return to port. The recording, which Osborne would later play for a journalist in 2008, captures a conversation between two people who understand that they are discussing something that has been deliberately removed from the institutional record. Trask tells Osborne about the 1979 samples, about the Nordic venture, about the hull damage, about the genetic match. There is a long pause on the line. Then Osborne says, "That's from 79? The canyon? Then it's been there the whole time." Another pause. Then, 26 years I've been on that water, and it's been in the canyon the entire time, and we've been dragging nets through its home. Trask asks him what he thinks the tissue is. What kind of animal could produce skin like that? Webbed membrane at that scale, digits 8 inches long with claws. Osborne's response, captured on the tape with the flat precision of a man who has spent his life cataloging species and does not say things he cannot support with observation, is 4 words. Nothing has been cataloged. The recording ends shortly after. Trask completed her master's degree with the redacted thesis and left the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She took a position with a private environmental consultancy in Portland, Oregon, and has not published on the subject of the Pribilof Canyon tissue since 1992. When contacted by journalists over the years, she has declined to comment, citing what she once described in an email as professional considerations that I am not at liberty to discuss. Dr. Metcalf, her thesis advisor, retired from the university in 2004 and has never spoken publicly about the incident, though a colleague who spoke on condition of anonymity told one researcher that Metcalf kept a copy of Trask's original, unredacted thesis chapter in his office safe until the day he cleared out his desk, and that he considered the suppression of her findings the single greatest professional regret of his career. The 1979 hull samples from the Nordic venture have not been returned to the university. Their current location is unknown. Kevin Liao, the NOAA observer, left government service in 1994, 2 years after the Agnes Marie incident, and took a position with a private aquaculture firm in British Columbia. In a brief statement he gave to a Canadian journalist in 2006, he said only that his time as a fisheries observer had shown him the distance between what is documented and what is acknowledged, and that he had no further comment on any specific incident. His photographs of the Agnes Marie tissue have never been released. The NOAA Observer report remains restricted. Hank Osborne continued to work as a fishmaster on Bering Sea trawlers until 2001, when he retired to his home in Ballard. In the years that followed, he turned down multiple requests for interviews, making an exception only once for a reporter from a Seattle alternative weekly who visited his home in 2008 and who Osborne allowed to examine, but not photograph, the species log. The reporter published a short piece that generated no follow-up from any mainstream outlet and was not cited in any subsequent investigation. When asked by the reporter why he had kept the log for 16 years, rather than turning it over to researchers or making it public, Osborne said, "Because every other piece of evidence has been taken. The photographs, the samples, the thesis, the observer report, all of it gone into a federal drawer somewhere. This notebook is the last record of what we pulled from that net. If I give it to them, there's nothing left. And there should be something left, But the record is not as complete as those agencies might wish. Because there is another piece of this story that the official record does not address: the gap between the two incidents. Between 1979 and 1992, at least 3 other vessels fishing the Pribilof Canyon's eastern rim reported equipment anomalies to the Coast Guard or to NOAA that were logged, filed, and never investigated. In 1983, a crab boat called the Sitka Rose reported sonar contacts rising vertically along the canyon wall at speeds inconsistent with any known marine species. The same behavior Carl O'Leary had documented in the Nordic Ventures log 4 years earlier. In 1986, a long liner working the canyon edge hauled up a set line with 3 hooks bent inward at angles that the captain told the Coast Guard could only have been produced by something gripping the line and pulling, not snagging on rock, not fouling on debris, but gripping with what the captain described in his filing as a hand or something shaped like a hand. In 1989, a processor vessel anchored near the canyon rim for the pollock season reported that its anchor chain had been disturbed during the night, pulled, taut, and then released repeatedly over a period of approximately 2 hours in a rhythm that the watch officer described as deliberate. None of these reports generated investigations. None of them were connected to the 1979 incident, because the 1979 incident was sealed. They sit in Coast Guard and NOAA filing systems as isolated anomalies, equipment malfunctions, unusual wildlife behavior, unexplained mechanical events, each one individually dismissible, and collectively forming a pattern that no one has been authorized to assemble. The facts, gathered from the sources that remain accessible: Kessler's letter to his brother, Price's handwritten note in his retirement papers, Osborne's species log, Trask's original lab notebook, the recorded phone conversation, the bridge officer's marginal notation about the stationary return at 350 meters, and the fragments of official documentation that have surfaced through FOIA requests over the years tell a story that the official record was designed to prevent. 2 incidents at the same coordinates, 13 years apart. One violent, a creature gripping a steel hull, a man pulled from the deck into the water, parallel gouges an inch deep in marine-grade steel. One quiet, fragments of tissue in a net, gray-white skin, and webbed membrane and clawed digits, the biological evidence of something large and uncatalogued living at the edge of the continental shelf, and the forensic link between them. Genetic material recovered from both incidents, analyzed by a graduate student who found the connection by accident and suppressed by institutions that understood what it meant and chose to make it disappear. The Pribilof Canyon is still there. The eastern rim still drops from 100 meters to over 400 in less than a mile. Trawlers still work the edge, dragging their nets through water that has never been surveyed with the specific purpose of determining what lives in the canyon's deepest reaches. NOAA's biological hazard designation, the one issued in 1981 and removed without explanation in 1983, has never been reinstated. No study has been commissioned. No investigation has been opened. Dale Kessler, in the final minutes of his 2003 interview with Martha Harwell, said something that has stayed with every person who has heard the recording. He said, "People ask me if I think it's still there. I don't think. I know. I know because the canyon is its home, and we are the ones who go there, and it was there before us, and it will be there after us, and the only question that matters is how many reports they've sealed that I don't know about." Hank Osborne, when the Seattle Reporter asked him the same question in 2008, gave an answer that arrived at the same conclusion from the opposite direction, not from the instinct of a man who had felt a creature grip his hull, but from the empirical certainty of a man who had held the evidence in his hands. He said, "I had the tissue on my sorting table. I drew it in my notebook. I measured the webbing, and I measured the claws. You don't need to ask me if it's real. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is why they won't let anyone study it. The number of sealed reports is not known. But the evidence that has surfaced, The testimony, the tissue, the genetic match, the photographs that were confiscated, the thesis chapter that was erased, suggests that what the Pribilof Canyon contains has been documented more than once, by more than one crew, and that the institutional response has been consistent across decades. Classify, seal, transfer, deny. The canyon keeps its own records. The question is whether we will ever be permitted to read them. If you have spent time on the Bering Sea, or if you know someone who has, if you have heard stories from the Pribilof Canyon that you are told not to repeat, or if you have seen something in those waters that you have never been able to explain, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.